Today, I'm happy to be presenting to you a complete repertoire against the French defense for the white pieces. Now, while this repertoire is aimed at beginners, it can be played by players of any level. Even super grandmasters, 2700s, have played it. Even the great Garry Kasparov has played the repertoire I am suggesting in broad terms. So let's jump in and take a look at what I'm recommending in this video. E4, E6, D4, D5. This is the French defense where black plays the moves E6 and D5, trying to create a strong point here on the D5 square. And white has many options here, but the option I am suggesting is the move E D5, the exchange variation. Now, let me explain to you why I am recommending the exchange variation. First, as I said, many very strong players have played this opening. And one of the things you have to know about French defense players, because I am a French defense player, I play both sides of the opening, the white and the black side of it. French defense players are tricksters. Um, Old books on the French defense will say that French players want to lock up the structure and want a maneuvering game. That is not an accurate description of the majority of French defense players. Most players of the French defense want to play a lot of tricks, and they want to win fairly quickly, actually. It's a surprise to some people. And by playing the exchange variation, you eliminate most of the tricks that French defense players can play. So that's very useful. Now, some people say, well, this is a boring way to play against the French. This is not true. What the repertoire I'm going to suggest is going to change the structure, so it's not going to remain a symmetrical structure throughout the entire repertoire. There is going to be imbalance, and I'm going to make sure that white gets their pieces developed comfortably, actively, and with a safe king, and avoiding any tricks that black might play. That's really what we're after in this line. And the final reason I'm recommending the French exchange is that French defense players hate it. Now, there are many books, even grandmasters have written, they'll say, oh, I love the French exchange. White gives up their chance for an advantage. They're not being honest. Trust me on that. French players do not like it. It takes it out of our comfort zone. It takes it out of the kind of positions that French players really are comfortable with and want to play. So I hope you enjoyed this video and make good use of this repertoire. Let's jump right in to the first section. After the exchange is made, white plays knight to f3, which is definitely the best square for the knight, and then bishop to d6. That is the most commonly played move that black has in this position. And one thing to remember that when black plays the bishop to d6, white often can go ahead and play c4. Not only is white threatening to gain space with c5, but if there's an exchange of these pawns and white ends up with an isolated queen's pawn, then this bishop at d6 is not that well placed for that particular type of structure. So black has a number of different ways to respond after white plays c4. They can play c6, but then again, white just develops naturally. The knight goes to c3, knight to e7, and bishop to d3. You see already white is doing fine against this bishop to d6 line. Castles, dc4, bishop takes c4. We've created the isolated pawn, but look at the comfortable development I told you would be getting in this opening. The knights and bishops are in good squares. White's castled. After knight to d7, the bishop can go to b3, and after bishop to g5, we can already see the very nicely placed pieces that white has. Pin on this knight, pin on the f7 pawn. If the king moves over to move that pawn, then just takes, queen e7, queen to d3, f6, knight to e4, and white's just doing great. White can play the rook to c1 opposite the queen. The bishop can sneak to c2 to threaten mate on h7. In this position, black is doing very well. So instead of c6, the knight to f6, but then just c5, kicks the bishop back, bishop to d3, castles, and then b6 to try to challenge white's space advantage at c5, but just bishop to e3, and after pawn takes, again, white has a very comfortable development. The knight can go to c3. Also, the knight can go from d4 to f5, supported by the bishop at d3. And again, white has a very comfortable position and a comfortable development. The main move for black after bishop d6 and c4 is to go ahead and take on c4, then bishop takes c4, and knight to f6. Now, the absolute main line for white in this position is to play queen to e2 check, and it probably is a bit better. But in this line, queens end up getting traded fairly early, and it's a little bit of an awkward endgame. I would recommend in this position that as white, you just play the most natural move on the board, which is castles, castles, then knight to c3. And look, again, we have the same situation. These well-developed pieces, you're castled, you're threatening a bishop coming into g5, and if black plays h6, then the knight can go to e5, and you're already developing a nice attacking formation. Knight c6, bishop to f4. If instead black doesn't play h6, but it plays knight to c6, then the bishop can go to g5. And just look at these pieces. Everything is well developed, king is castled, and white can be happy about the variation against bishop to d6. Now, after knight to f3, what if instead of bishop to d6, black plays knight to f6, also a very common move? Well, in that position, I'm recommending that white plays bishop to d3, putting the bishop on an active diagonal. So let's look at black's responses. One, black can play c5, which isn't a bad idea at all. Just like we saw the bishop on d6 wasn't well placed in an isolated queen's pawn position, this bishop isn't ideally placed either. So in this position, I'm just recommending that white castles, and after c4 to hit the bishop, to play rook to e1 check before you retreat the bishop at d3. The bishop is blocked, just bishop back to f1, castles, and now b3, attacking this space. You do want to attack c4 as quickly as possible, because you don't want black to get a crushing space advantage. After cb3, ab3, if knight to c6, the knight can jump into e5, gain space. And if bishop to g4, just h3, bishop h5, g4, bishop g6. And then in this position, white can play this little tricky idea of rook takes bishop. But after queen takes rook, bishop to a3, skewering the queen and the rook. After queen to d8, you just take the rook, and then c4. And white has a decent position at that point. If instead of queen to d8, play queen to e6, then after bishop f8, king f8, c4 again, knight c6, and knight to c3. And once again, white has a very nice development. This bishop also at some point could go to g2. So if instead of c5, what if black plays the move bishop to e7? Not very aggressive. Bishop g5, castles, castles, bishop g4, knight b to d2, knight b to d7, c3, and c6. Now, black could play c5 to try to break the symmetry. Then for h3, bishop h5, queen to c2, c4, then bishop to f5. And white has a fairly aggressive position. This bishop is well placed. This knight can jump in to the e5 square. After c6, rook to e1. And I will say about this variation, this is one of the lines where the structure does stay fairly symmetrical, and you want to get as much of a development advantage as possible, perhaps even double on the e-file when you get a chance. Rook to e8, queen to c2, h6, bishop f4. If knight to h5, aiming at this bishop, you can just play the bishop to e5, and when the knight takes, bishop to h7 check, king f8, then knight takes bishop. And in this position, you can see that white's king is safer. Black's king is quite uncomfortable here on f8, and white can be happy about the position at this particular juncture. Instead of rook to e8, bishop h5, queen to b3 is also a playable idea. Going after this pawn and also going after the bishop on e7. h6, bishop to h4, knight h5, bishop e3, f5. Then you just retreat the knight so that this bishop has a retreat after f5. And black is becoming overextended on the king side. So after bishop to d6, which is the most common move for black, queen to e2 check. This is the best move in this position. If bishop to e6, then knight to g5. The idea is you want to hit that bishop and take away the advantage of the two bishops. If queen e7, you just take the bishop. And if bishop to e7, just castles, castles, rook e1. And again, we have a very natural development for the white pieces. So the main move here for black is queen to e7. Exchanging queens, king takes e7, if bishop e7, bishop f4, and c6 castles. And again, we have kind of in this position, white's going to play the knight to e5 and get an okay position. I mean, it is still fairly equal here, but white has a little something. But the main move here is actually take with the king. After castles, rook to e8, exchange off rooks, knight to c3, c6, playing for a lead in development in this position. Rook e1, king f8, knight e5. This is a key idea for white in the exchange French. If white can get a knight established on e5, then he can support it with the move f4 and get a pretty tough position for black to deal with. Knight b to d7, f4 is played, just as was mentioned. And in this position, white can be very happy with the result. And that is the repertoire when at move 4, black plays knight to f6. Well, what if after knight to f3, instead of bishop to d6 or knight to f6, black plays knight to c6 to put immediate pressure on the d4 pawn, but blocking his own pawn at c7? Well, in that case, I'm recommending h3 and a bishop to d6, c4. If bishop to f5, then just bishop to b5, castles knight to e7, and then you break in the center. And again, we see white has a very comfortable development. If instead knight to f6 is played, then just bishop to d3, bishop to d6, castles, castle, and c3. And again, white has a nice development, and this knight on c6 is not well placed because it doesn't have a very comfortable landing square. After rook to e8, bishop g5, again, white is doing fine. So the main idea here for black is bishop to d6, d4, cd4, bishop takes c4, knight f6, knight to c3, and again, we have our very nice formation of pieces and castles, and white can be happy with the outcome of the opening in this position. The bishop can go to g5, the rook can go to e1, and white is doing quite well in that position. Well, what if instead of any of those moves, black plays the move bishop to g4, immediately pinning the knight before white has any chance to attack in the center or play h3 to stop it? Well, in this position, you play h3 as white. Then after bishop to h5 check, then you play queen to e2 check. Now, after bishop to e7, white can play g4, bishop g6, and bishop to g2, and is getting a lot of space, is aiming at this d5 pawn. If knight f6, knight to e5, immediately threatening to grab the two bishops already. Castles, bishop to e3, knight b to d7, capture the two bishops, knight to d2, and here white can castle long and continue the attack with the march of the kingside pawns, and white has a very good position in that case. So because of that, the main move here is queen to e7. Now you do not trade queens in this position, but instead play bishop to e3. After knight c6, knight to c3, long castling. So in this, for black, so in this position, white advances with g4, the bishop goes back to g6, now white long castles. Now here, there are a few moves black can play. Queen to b4, just to basically put the queen around white's king, but then h4, and you're already threatening h5, gaining a lot of space. If f6 to give the bishop a place to hide, a3 hits the queen, queen goes back, h5, bishop f7, then knight to d2, and white is already planning a strong attack against black's king. The king can move over, the knight can go to b3 and c5, the queen can go to b5. White is doing very well in that position, and if instead white plays knight to f6, then the knight can just jump into to e5 in that position, and is doing quite well. If you are wondering why black cannot just take on e5, because after pawn takes, queen takes, white has f4, and then when the queen moves f5, and the old Noah's Ark traps that bishop on g6. So because of that, the main move we're going to look at here for black is knight to b4. Black is attacking c2 with the bishop and the knight, but in that case, all white does is knight to e1. And after that, you can play king to b1, you can kick the knight out, and then the knight will come and centralize itself. It can land on either e5 or c5. The bishop can go to g2, the rook can come to the middle of the board. White has a very nice position after the move bishop to g4. Well, what if black tries to do what white does? When a lot of our lines, white has played c4 to try to get a free, comfortable position with an isolated queen's pawn. What if they play c5 here? Well, you remember I said to play c4 when the bishop is at d6 because the d6 square is not a very good square. Well, in this position, our bishop, if it were at d3, then c5 might be a good move. But playing move c5 here before the bishop at f1 has developed is premature because white can move that bishop to an even better square. And in this case, the response to c5 is bishop to b5 check. Knight to c6, and castles, knight to f6. And yes, rook to e1 check is a perfectly good move, but a move that might be more uncomfortable for black is an immediate knight to e5, immediately attacking that knight on c6. Bishop to d7, and then rook to e1 creates all kinds of threats down the e file. The bishop to e7 to develop that bishop and block the e file. The knight takes d7, queen takes d7, and you can see that white already has a two-bishop advantage. You can take on c5, and this bishop cannot take this pawn back because it's pinned to the king. After knight to e4, and this was played by Anish Giri as white against Golubov, bishop to e3 protects the pawn. Giri played b4, which is a decent move. The computer prefers defending with the piece, with bishop to e3, then castles, knight to c3. After knight c3, b takes c3. Yes, these pawns are tripled, but they control a lot of key squares. And white has the two bishops and is currently up a pawn. So white can be very, very happy with this recommendation after the move c5. And for this last section, we're going to do a little cleanup, some very rarely played moves, but just a recommendation of how to deal with them. If the move bishop to f5 is played, in order to challenge any bishop move to d3, I recommend just going ahead and playing the bishop to d3 in that case. If the bishop moves to g6, you just castle. And here, again, the bishop moved to d6. So what's the move we play in that case? That's right, c4. And then if, excuse me, if bishop takes d3, queen d3, and white has a nice lead in development and also has potential threats with c5, and then queen to b5 check is on the board. And if pawn takes, just bishop takes c4. And white has a very comfortable development. Knight to c3, rook to e1, bishop g5, doing fine. And the last line to look at very quickly is c6. If black chooses to try to strengthen d5 without developing a piece, we just develop to d3, knight f6, castles, bishop e7, rook to e1, castles. And here we can take time to play h3 to keep this bishop on c8 from developing to a comfortable square. Knight b to d2, bishop f4. And again, we're just developing. This is a symmetrical structure. And of g6, the idea here is to play the knight to g7 and then the bishop to f5 to challenge this bishop at d3. But white can just play the knight into e5. And then after knight to g7, white can play g4. Yes, you're moving the pawns in front of your king, but it's very hard for black to take advantage of that. And that pawn at g4 is very annoying for black because he cannot develop anything to the f5 square. The knight goes to d7, just exchange it, and knight to f3. And white has a very strong position. The knight can go to e5, the queen can go to d2, the pawn can go to f4 to support the knight at e5, and white can be very happy. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief presentation, and I hope it does help you in future games sidestep all of black's trickery in the French defense and help you win games in the future. Thank you for tuning into Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.